and it's not just for the sake of the Jewish community, it's really for the sake of society as a whole, to keep the lessons of the Holocaust alive. And yes, it's tragic that as survivors pass, first-hand experiences and accounts of those lessons and the events that from which those lessons are drawn seem to fade in public memory. And it's also the fact that that whole generation that fought Nazism, soldiers and returned service people from countries like Australia and many other countries, and whose stories were part of the discourse around the dinner table for a whole generation of people in the immediate aftermath of World War II, is also fading. So that the level of historical knowledge, and particularly knowledge of the Holocaust, is diminishing. And there was a report really issued early last year by the Gandalf Foundation, which had actually measured the extent of Holocaust knowledge and Holocaust ignorance, and ignorance more generally about the events of World War II in Australia. And it showed quite alarming decline in that level of awareness. And the import of that for our society in terms of the lessons for tolerance, freedom, social cohesion, and so on have never been more important, because we do in stressful times. So it really does underline the importance of museums and school education and university education and so on.
And speaking of that, what is the reality with the ongoing incidents of anti-Semitic incidents in Australia?
Well, we've just released our report today. The Executive Council of Australian Jewry does an annual report on anti-Semitism in Australia. We've done it for the last 30 years. The statistics are quite alarming. The incidents have increased by an additional 7% over the last 12 months, but that's off the back of an increase of 35% over the previous year. So that's a 42% increase just in 2 years. And it mirrors, we think, reported increases in anti-Semitic incidents in other countries. And it's not the sort of thing that we expect in a country, Australia, which we're accustomed to think of as a peaceful and cohesive society.
And so what are some of the worst examples you've come across in Australia, and what do you think is behind this?
Well, the sorts of incidents can vary from physical assaults to verbal abuse, harassment and intimidation of individuals, bullying of Jewish people in schools and in the workplace, malicious damage to property, graffiti attacks on synagogues and other Jewish institutions, hate emails and hate messages directly, postering and stickering in neighbourhoods where there are large concentrations of Jewish people, and so on. What can be done about it? Well, I think there needs to be a three-pronged approach to it. Firstly, the political messaging from our leaders, and not just our elected leaders, but also community leaders, needs to be the right messaging. It has to say that racism of any sort, but particularly anti-Semitism, which tends to be a litmus test for so many other forms of bigotry, cannot be tolerated in a free and democratic society. And that messaging has to be loud, clear and consistent. Secondly, there's legislation. Legislation does have a role to play. We have laws against incitement of racial hatred and threatening of racially motivated violence. And that's a good start. We also increasingly are seeing states like New South Wales, Victoria and other states are now looking at this as well, introducing laws to ban the public display of Nazi symbols, and that's to be welcomed. But I think really the key prong in the strategy has to be education, which is what I started out talking about. We need to address not only the virtues that make our society what it is, the virtues of tolerance and mutual respect, but also educating people specifically to identify prevalent forms of racism in Australian society, whether it's anti-Semitism or racism against First Nations people, Islamophobia, anti-Asian racism, and so on.
It seems
Our students, our younger people need to be educated about these specific things.
For a lot of people out there, and especially people who watch ABC TV, I guess, it seems to be there has been a growing awareness of the importance of stamping out racism. Do you think there has been a lot of work done in this area, and what else do you think could be done?
Look, there has been work done in the area, and it's all positive and a good start, but it's clearly not enough. And it isn't really attacked in a systematic way. We have different branches of government doing different things, but there doesn't seem to be a whole of government approach to dealing with systemic racism and more importantly, with specific forms of racism like anti-Semitism. And there's also a lot of misconceptions out there increasingly about anti-Semitism in particular. Too often, there's a denial that a particular form of anti-Semitism constitutes anti-Semitism, or that the particular incidents that occur are anti-Semitic in nature. I mean, the overwhelming majority of Jewish people will see particular incidents as anti-Semitic, but I'll just give you one example rather than talking in the abstract. This is just a report that I saw yesterday from Sweden, of all places, an enlightened liberal democracy, where a protest is being planned outside the Israeli embassy, which in and of itself is not anti-Semitic, but then they're planning, as part of that protest, to burn a Torah scroll. That's bad enough. And the Swedish authorities, the police, have apparently granted permission to do this in the name of freedom of expression, because they just don't see this as anti-Semitic. Now, that clearly is probably one of the more extreme examples of what I'm talking about. And it's as much an indication of the lack of awareness and the eroding of sensitivity to anti-Semitism as anything else. And it's clear that examples like that, you can ask 99% of Jewish people, they would see the burning of the Torah scroll as obviously anti-Semitic. And yet, even in a country like Sweden, the point seems to be missed.
Okay, just on another issue, it's been a violent day in the occupied West Bank. Israeli forces have killed 9 Palestinians in an operation the military says was aimed at jihadi militants planning major attacks. The Palestinians have described it as a massacre and say a 61-year-old woman is among the dead. What do you make of the latest violence there?
Look, I'm always very sceptical of these hyperbolic claims, black and white. Clearly what has happened there is there's been a fight between a heavily armed terrorist group, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Israeli Defence Forces. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I call them a terrorist organisation because they are listed as such by Australia. And judging by what happened there was no massacre. It was a armed combat between a very heavily armed Palestinian terrorist group and the Israeli armed forces, in which, sadly, tragically, a woman, a 61-year-old Palestinian woman who was watching from a nearby window was hit by a stray bullet and was killed. That's always a tragedy in any situation. But bear in mind that these Palestinian groups like Islamic Jihad have a policy of deliberately ensconcing themselves in densely populated civilian areas so that the chances of something like that happening, even though obviously this woman would not have been a target of a raid, the chances are heightened by that policy. And we've always got to be very, very careful when hearing these reports, not just to focus on the effects of what has happened, but on the causes and why things have happened the way they've happened.
And what do you think of the prospects for this region with Israel-Palestine relations under this new Israeli government, which is seen as the most right-wing in Israeli history?
Look, there's plenty of debate within Israel itself about the new government. It was elected through a democratic process. That doesn't mean that everybody in Israel, or even a majority of people in Israel, support every policy that this government stands for. Even Israel's president, Isaac Herzog, has expressed concern about some of the policies that some of the ministers apparently stand for. Having said that, we've also seen in recent days that the Israeli Supreme Court ordered the sacking of a particular minister who's in that right-wing coalition, and compliance with that order by the Prime Minister of Israel. So that, I think, indicates that concerns about the future of the rule of law in Israel are perhaps exaggerated, but that doesn't mean that all the concerns about the future direction of this government are unwarranted. The difficulty is sorting out the legitimate from the illegitimate, as there's so much variance between perception and reality in the Middle East. There is room, really, for legitimate debate in any democracy about the proper process for making judicial appointments. In Australia, judges are appointed by governments, and from time to time that gives rise to concerns and debate about possible political interference in the process. In the United States, judges are appointed by the president, and there's a process of confirmation through the Senate. In Israel, judges of the Supreme Court are appointed by other judges, and that also gives rise to legitimate concerns about groupthink and a culture that entrenches itself. So there is room for legitimate debate about these sorts of issues in Israel. But on the other hand, some of the more extreme things that some of the politicians have said about that process are completely illegitimate and are rightly, I think, criticised.